Welcome back to another episode of the Styleframe Saturdays podcast, the podcast dedicated to ideation, creative thinking, and concept development as it pertains to an animated production. We'll be breaking down the brief of our guests' favorite frames, and we'll also get a glimpse into the inspiration and workflows behind their frame of choice as well. We've got an exciting episode for you today with Jaime Justen, an art director based out of Brooklyn, New York. So let's jump in. Hi, Jaime. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. How's everything going?
Hi, good. How are you?
I'm good. It's the holiday season right now, so I'm enjoying that and getting ready for the new year. How about yourself?
Same, just starting to wrap up some projects. I'm on my last freelance gig starting next week, and then have a nice long time off. So I'm really excited to just relax.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, no, I'm so excited to see what you're working on for the end of the year. I know we've chatted in the past. I've been a big fan of your work for some time now. So I'm so excited that you were able to join us to kick off season 2 for the podcast today. But, if it's okay with you, I'd love to jump into things. For anyone who doesn't know you, would you mind telling our audience a little bit about yourself, perhaps a little bit about your story and how you got into the field of animation and motion design?
Yeah, so originally I started going off to college at Michigan State. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was kind of in the arts in high school, but there wasn't really an extensive program where I went to school in Buffalo. So I kind of floundered a little. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Found my way to graphic design and realized, okay, I actually have a passion for this. I transferred schools and went to SUNY Purchase. That's where I graduated. And at the time, they didn't have a huge motion graphics program. You were really studying graphic design. And there were maybe 2 other people in my program who got really heavily into motion graphics. And none of the professors knew how to teach you how to do anything really. The concepts, but it was really limited as far as like the technology goes. So but I really lucked out because I was one of a few people. We had an adjunct professor who needed interns at Comedy Central. So I was one of 2 people who he even asked because not many people were very interested in doing motion graphics and the other person didn't want to do it. So I got to. And that really kicked things off for me. I really loved animation and just like the satisfaction of nailing the motion of the designs was really satisfying to me. So I really pursued that. After college, I freelanced with Comedy Central for a while, kind of worked my way up. For a while, I was not really doing motion graphics there because they didn't have a position for me, but I started off in the digital department, kind of like finding motion graphics projects where I could. And then I kind of just worked my way up there. Eventually, they were doing a lot of digital originals. They were doing a Snapchat channel for a while. So I was able, kind of a weird thing about a big company is that you can make projects your own if you just have you kind of just have to see the opportunity, and there's not much oversight sometimes. So you'll be like, okay, I think we should do this. And because it's such a big machine, sometimes you can kind of get away with that, which was nice for me at the time. I was finding these moments where I ended up building my own team. We ended up working with the digital original projects where they would bring in comedians to kind of get them used to creating content when they maybe weren't used to that like structured atmosphere. So a lot of times it was lower budget. They needed a lot of graphics to help support the shows. And so I ended up being the motion graphic design lead there, the design director for motion graphics for the digital department. And that was really great. I was at Comedy Central for 7 years, and then moved over to First Look Media, doing a lot of in-house content with them, but also marketing. And then I was there for a year, and then I was at Block and Tackle for a year and a half, which was a really great experience. And recently I just went freelance. So trying out that life now.
Very cool. And, to go back to the Comedy Central part of your career so far, it had to have been an interesting time because I'm assuming it was, early 2000s, right? You were saying comedians are coming in and you guys are getting them used to kind of creating content. I feel like that's when things really took off in terms of like all the social media stuff. And then really for our industry, it created just kind of all these amazing, different, weird opportunities that you were just touching upon, that, like you were kind of creating what you wanted to. Kind of were getting this freedom to do and make things what you wanted to make of them. So it's really interesting to hear that, like, in your role specifically at Comedy Central, but then obviously over the course of the other, roles that you've had as well, that, you've kind of been, taking the lead with a lot of this stuff. So it's just really cool to hear that you're kind of spearheading some of this stuff too.
Yeah, and it was really great too because a lot of people working on these projects, they're not design minded in this way that like I think if I had worked somewhere where, at a studio right away, everybody is already on the same page about aesthetics and like, but I was able to bring like a quality standard to things that they weren't really used to. They were used to just kind of like things looking bad to look bad. And that is definitely fun. And I do love design like that, but it was fun to also be able to be like, oh, I actually could think about this in a way that you may not have ever thought of. And I was able to work with directors and the people coming up with the ideas to say, well, what if we shot, a lot of people wanted to shoot everything on green screen. And it's like, well,
Mm.
that doesn't really always make sense. Like you could shoot it on a nice seamless color and we can add graphics around the people and even behind them. And you don't need, it's so much more work to like key it out and make it look good and like professional
Right.
when that's not really, when you want a lo-fi look, that's great with green screen, but if you want something that feels a little bit more polished, there's other ways to go about it. And so it was really nice to like add that knowledge to the production process and be on stage while they're shooting and really a part of the creation. That was really exciting, and that's something that I'm hoping to get a little more back to. I think that being a part of studios, it was something I always dreamed of. Like Block and Tackle was my dream job, but I realized that
Oh,
you
cool.
become very removed from the process of creation with the people making these shows. And I'm hoping now to like get a little closer to what I was doing before at Comedy Central, where you're part of that early development phase. It's not that they're coming to, the show's already made, all those decisions have been made, and now they're just coming to you to either promote it or make a poster. I really want to be
Sure.
more involved because it's so much fun working with the people who are so passionate about these projects and helping them, make it as good as it can be, using your skills.
No, absolutely. Well, I hope that you are getting some of those opportunities because, like you said, at the places that you've been staff, you've been heavily involved in those early concept parts of projects, and which I really much enjoy too. I think it's like the most fun part about the projects that we work on as motion designers and animators. But speaking of the early concept stuff, and touching upon, the block and tackle stuff here too as well, I'd love to chat about the frame that you're sharing with us today. So could you tell us a little bit about the piece that you've selected?
Yeah, so I picked the title card that we ended up making for a promo package, for a show called, it actually ended up being called Children of the Underground, but while we were working on it, it was all called Children Underground. So I still have that frame with that title. It was an FX show, a documentary about a woman, Faye Yeager, who in the, I think, early 90s, she had this underground system of saving children of in households of abuse. And there's like watching the documentary, there's different opinions about like whether what she was doing was positive or negative. But we got the brief at Block and Tackle. I was actually on a different project and kind of came in like a few days into people already working on it. And um, we just had the brief, the description of and the details about Faye. Obviously, someone that was easy to like look up and do more research on. But we were also told we couldn't use any visuals of her. We could not use. They had nothing. The show hadn't been done being made, so we didn't have any access to footage or anything from the show. So, which is pretty common where you're working and you don't have access to the show itself. Sometimes I struggle with that though. For me, it's like, I really want to know, like, okay, what is the tone of the whole show. For this one, it really worked out though. I for these frames was going for this idea of like she was a very meticulous at keeping documents of every case with every child, did a lot of interviews, so involved in every case. So I kept having this vision of like her taking notes. And I read some interviews with children who had been in her system where they were kind of like rushed around at night and finding these different houses where that were their safe points. So this imagery of like, you know, watching the street go by, maybe in the back of a car, and all of the documents that she might have had. This was also the 90s, so it has a very specific tactile look that we were going for. Um, so yeah, it was really a lot of materials and ideas that were easy to draw from. And then we had this really great idea of bringing in photography from everybody in the studio. So we're all like kind of around the same age. So it worked out well that we had all of these older photos that were film photos, usually disposable, very 90s feeling. This one specifically, actually, is a picture of my boyfriend's mother and his uncles. So a little
Oh,
older.
no
That
way.
one's in the 70s, I think, maybe even 60s. And so it was really fun to take these pictures and knowing that like it was all these people that I actually worked with or knew, and ended up being used throughout all of the promotional pieces. So
That's really cool.
yeah.
Yeah, no, oh my gosh. You mentioned so many fun, amazing things that I want to talk about and get into like the nitty-gritty and specifics of. But you know, the concept, you know, I was looking at your case study about this project, and looking at Block and Tackle's site too. So, you know, reading about Faye Yeager's story and everything, you know, is just really interesting, you know, and the fact that it's a little controversial at the same time too, you know, kind of adds that drama aspect and everything. But I loved the whole tactile experience about this project. I love what you guys did with it and everything. But before we get into like some of the creative and design decision stuff around it, you know, I'd love to like go to like the very beginning, actually, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
You know, and start with your initial conversations with FX. You know, what did it sound like? You know, how did you guys kind of like sculpt the creative brief for this project?
Yeah, so I think we had a lot of limitations, but they really allowed us to explore. We explored a lot of different visual directions. Some of all of them having this slightly dark tone to them because obviously there's a lot of questions around it. You know, the topic of abuse in itself is very dark, and so there's these themes around each direction that we explored. Um, but the limitation of not having many visuals to use while still wanting to keep it photographic in a way was really important. So I think that like it was really just going kind of all out at first. We had four different designers working on several different directions and just exploring how you can get that tone of, you know, what is this story, the mystery around this woman, and you know, the system that she built that is very controversial. Yeah, I don't, we just kind of went all out and explored, but in the end, it really having these visuals of the children, it became really important. You know, we had a few directions that were a little more symbolic, using, I think, like butterflies to represent the children. There were a few different ways that we tried to take it, but in the end, seeing that emotional connection of children really helps to drive home the deeper, you know, show how important what she was doing was.
Right.
So yeah, that's where we landed. And yeah, sorry, I'm kind of like tripping up on my words now.
That's okay. No, don't worry about it. Well, I mean, you know, it makes sense, you know, like you want to have a visual representation to whatever, like, you know, the story is about. Um, It's really cool to hear though that, you guys were playing around with other variations and types of imagery to get that point across. Like, like, yes, was it going to be more symbolic or was it going to be a bit more literal? And it sounds like, you landed on a little more of a literal representation of what this sort of Children of the Underground and what Faye Yeager had built was all about. But to that, it does sound like FX maybe gave you guys kind of like complete creative freedom to kind of go off and do whatever you wanted to do visually, aesthetically.
Yeah, I think, well, something really interesting about Block and Tackle is that they had such a close relationship with people at FX. So I think that
Right.
they've worked with them for so long that they really trust the process that the team has there. They, on every project that we pitch on for FX, it's very like, and I think Block and Tackle has a little bit of a style, even though they can do anything really. There's such a talented group of people there. There's a little bit of a style, and I'm sure that there's a thought behind like, okay, if we bring in FX or Block and Tackle for this, there's certain aesthetics that we might get.
Sure.
So, but and I think that the creative directors there have a really good grasp on like what is appropriate for a project. But there's always that element of play at the beginning and trying to not just, it's always about, is this appropriate for the topics, for the messaging of the show, and that really drives the design. And so, that can come out in a variety of ways, but it's always going to end up
Mm-hmm.
narrowing down to, okay, this actually feels like the best way to represent this show.
For sure. No, definitely. Well, given that you guys were able to kind of do a bit of like exploration at the beginning, most projects do start out that way, but I'm just curious, what was the timeline like for this project?
I think this one was relatively quick, but it actually felt, compared to some others, it felt like it was appropriate. We had a big sprint at the beginning. I feel like at first there were maybe, like I said, I think four of us working on designs over the
Okay.
course of I think a week to do that initial pitch phase,
Hmm.
and they ended up choosing this one. It was slightly different before in the initial pitch.
Okay.
And we got to this after I think two rounds. So, but this one went pretty smoothly. Sometimes I wonder if that just means there's not a huge budget, so it's like, okay, we got to make decisions. And um, but so that they chose this direction with obviously some tweaks. I think in the initial version, I had some. We didn't have pictures of Faye, but I had found some um, a woman who looked kind of like her. So I had these elements. It was a little more Faye driven because with the brief that we were given, it felt like she was so central. But again, they wanted to bring in more of the children because that is just more of like an emotional impact as you're watching these promos.
Hmm.
Um, so we pulled back on elements that alluded to like her as a person and brought the children a little bit more to the forefront. Um, and then so I think with design, it was maybe a week or probably 2 weeks to like get through from the initial phase to where it landed, and then an additional probably 2 or 3 weeks to develop the animation language. It was a smaller team. Like after that initial push, primarily just myself and an animator were working on it. After that,
Okay.
it's a little bit of a simple style, so it didn't really need like a whole team of people dedicated.
Sure.
And obviously, there's other projects going on in the studio at the same time. So I think even after that had wrapped, I had started on something else, and we were kind of going back and forth. I was overseeing the animation alongside the creative director as well, since the design had already been finished up. Um, so a pretty nice timeline. I'd say that's not always typical, which is, it's part of the industry and is something that I'm trying to like figure out how to make myself feel comfortable with. I think that there's been this big push to produce, 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 produce all the time and to do it
For
on
sure.
faster and tighter timelines, which I think is a little unhealthy and kind of just like feeding into the capitalism mindset that the society has right now. And I think like pushing for more periods of exploration, slowing things down a little bit is something that like we as an industry need to be a little more adamant about. So when that happens naturally, it's very nice, and I think is the way it should always be.
No, it's fun. It's funny you say that because I feel like, previous guests on the show, and everybody's different too in terms of like how they approach their projects and everything and so on and so forth. And again, how big of the team is, what's being asked of the creative brief and like how many people are actually necessary to like kind of get it done.
Hmm.
But yeah, like, Justin Harder has been on and he's kind of said, like for him, when there's kind of a little bit of a fire being lit up underneath the project to like really get it done and push through, like that like amps him up to like really like, and it pushes his creative and stuff. But then, there are other guests on the podcast who have come on and kind of said, yeah, like, we had X amount of time, a good chunk of time for the sort of exploration and ideation part of the project. And it felt appropriate because it really felt like we could take our time to kind of really truly explore like what different approaches might look and feel like. And so that's always an interesting conversation to have with people in our industry, is sort of like, what is the appropriate timeline? I'm sure there's no sort of one size fits all. Again, every project is unique and different, and every team, and their approaches are unique and different. But I always think it's kind of an interesting conversation to hear what the timelines are behind these types of projects, because it kind of makes you wonder, what's pushing the creative? Like, is that element pushing the creative, or is it, like, were some other concepts, like not considered because of the timeline? So it's really cool to hear that, like for this, it felt pretty appropriate, to get the job done. And it looks beautiful.
Thanks.
I'm a huge fan of this style that, you and the team at Block and Tackle have, are maybe a little recognized for. It's not Block and Tackle's sole style. You guys have done so many other great things as well, but like you can immediately kind of tell that like, oh yeah, this team put their thumb on it for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think timelines it, each project is so unique, and for me, I think that's something that I really want to explore more being freelance now, is that I can't always just turn on my creativity. For me, it's just not the way I work. And for the longest time, I was really a little bit ashamed of that. Like, I felt less than because I didn't feel like I could constantly turn it on, come out with a good idea, no matter the timeline, no matter the brief. And I'm starting to realize like that's okay. And that
Yeah.
it's, I need to figure out the best way for me to work. And right now it's getting my creativity back by, maybe I'm not always the lead on a project, and maybe I'm kind of doing a little bit more of a production role at times, and then I'm able to turn it on and be that lead on other projects, and have a balance of that in my life. And I think it's really something that like we don't talk about enough. I feel like all of like the bigger names and like the people who are really successful in our industry, it feels like if they're just able to create, 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 and that's just something that I don't align with really. I think it's been really great to be able to slow down, take more time off. I've been doing like woodworking classes and just trying
Oh,
to
cool.
think outside of the motion design industry in order to have creativity when I do need to turn it on. So it's exciting to explore that right now in my career.
Very cool. Yeah, no, well, I mean, we could have an entire conversation on this subject alone because, we talk about the echo chamber of motion graphics and stuff from time to time here as well. But, we will have to have you on for a second, like sort of follow up about just this particular topic alone, because, it's a conversation that happens, but, yeah, like we definitely need to do a follow up on that
Yeah.
for sure. It's definitely a very interesting topic to talk about. Absolutely. Well, to go back to, this project in particular a little bit some more. So now we have like kind of a rough idea that it was probably about like 6-ish weeks total to kind of get this whole project done. If I'm counting the weeks that you
Yes,
mentioned
yeah,
correctly.
around there. I think so.
Okay. You mentioned that it was a promo package too. So I'm just curious, what pieces did you have to create for the package within this timeline? Was it just this sort of like opener ident, so to speak, or were there other elements that you had to do as well?
Yeah, so with promo packages, we usually do, a 10-second identity, a 5 second, and then a full package of title cards. We have like the VAC, where it's like the for mature audiences rating. There's lower thirds. We have like the open sting for FX, where they now have like big FX logo. It's kind of always changing. So there's a whole series of package elements, and then we also toolkit all of those out. So they have to be
Oh,
editable
cool.
by the FX team. Their team, obviously, they have like more in-house designers that know After Effects, so we don't have to have completely like polished toolkits for them. They were a little bit less intense, and as far as like they're able to like move the layers around and they know what they're doing over there. So, but we still build things out and have them like really clean and polished. And that there's a whole system of like, you know, someone creates it, we're all checking through and catching any mistakes, and collaborating on making sure that those are as polished as they can be. So that's another big element of our timeline, outside of just creating each animation.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, yeah. No, I know that I saw that you mentioned toolkitting on the on your case study as well. So it's really cool to hear that you guys are like heavily involved with really sort of like QCing and quality controlling. What is being handed off to obviously then use to, promote it even further beyond, the block and tackle studio and everything. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
And, I know that so you've briefly touched on, what the creative process looked like kind of developing this style. We've talked about how, that there were some variations that were sort of, put out there initially and everything. But because now we kind of have like a good idea of what the brief was like between block and tackle and FX. I was wondering if you could kind of dive in a little bit further into like what your creative process looked like on this project.
Yeah, so we had we've done a lot of these types of like kind of tactile, PC elements in the past that block and tackle. So I had a few even like motion examples that our creative director had showed me, and as far as like what he envisioned maybe the motion language could be. So that was really helpful to see. And then, just doing research on Faye herself, trying to find pieces and visuals that fit well with that time period. I ended up doing a lot of like handwritten little notes. I thought it was really interesting that she had taken, really meticulous notes, and there were certain phrases that kept coming up in the research I did about her. She had in her interview, she had said like, "Are you safe?" Kind of had a really intense interview process with each child. So that was something I
Oh,
kind of
wow.
clung on to, and had done some like handwritten notes, and that ended up being in the package here and there. I wanted it to be a little more like custom, but
Mm-hmm.
we didn't end up taking it that far. But so yeah, it was a lot of just playing around and then collaging really in the end. It was which ends up feeling almost like a process of painting, it's really
Oh,
fluid and
interesting.
therapeutic. I feel like it's just like working through cutting up pieces, mostly in Photoshop, but and just trying to make compositions that feel very fluid. That really helps then in the animation phase. Obviously, it was, I think, not that difficult for our animator David to then go in and kind of translate that into this like quick but moments of fluidity, where these pieces are kind of floating in this abstract space. Um, yeah, I hope that answered your question.
No, it definitely does. And you touched upon some stuff that like, I was hoping that you might, throw out there too, because it sounds like, you guys are, obviously doing the digital portion of it. You're jumping in Adobe, software like Photoshop and After Effects and so on and so forth, but that you're actually kind of introducing these sort of practical effects too. And, I've always just assumed that like, that's kind of part of the block and tackle workflow and process, but it's actually really cool to hear how you guys are kind of approaching those sort of like more tactile and customized elements as well. But it's really cool to hear too that you're doing a ton of research on the subject as well. I mean, as the creatives, you kind of have to, right? It's just part of the process. But were you jumping from research kind of right into designing the frames, or were you kind of doing the research mood boarding it or boarding things out before going into design? Like, what did that part of the project look like for you?
Yeah, it's always different. And I do feel, for me, it's this one had already started when I jumped in. So typically, when I do work on a project, I am mood boarding a lot more. But because there was such a mood set by the brief, it wasn't entirely necessary to do that. It kind of, and because they were a little bit further along in the process, I grabbed some styles that I thought felt appropriate and kind of did that for myself. I like to go through on Pinterest. I'm a big Pinterest fan. I feel like if you use it right, it brings you the best inspiration.
For sure.
So I started my own little like Pinterest gathering. A lot of, I felt like collage was appropriate for this kind of from the
Hmm.
get-go. So I had started just like pulling mood board inspiration. But in this specific project, that wasn't a step that we did with the client. Um, but I think everybody ends up like doing a level of that for themselves in order to just like get into the zone. So there definitely was like that step for myself. And then kind of jumping immediately into style frames, which we at that point I had been at Block and Tackle for a year, I believe. And it again, it's different for every project, but when you know this
Hmm.
like package that you have to create, it becomes a little bit, you're so familiar with like the system of it all. It does it there's
Hmm.
And the animations aren't that extensive. You're not creating like a full on narrative. They're pretty quick. They
Hmm.
have to kind of get that message across very fast. So having that phase of sketching, your designs kind of become the sketch. Obviously those are going to develop over time, but you don't really
Right.
need that phase of like figuring out the story because they're so quick. The design will really influence what that animation will be in the end. So it's a little bit different than some other like larger animation projects where there's like a fuller story to
Sure.
the actual motion of things. Um,
That makes a whole lot of sense. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it's sometimes that can be difficult when I find it harder when there is we were working on stuff for Archer where that is a little bit character driven. So you do need a little bit of a
Right.
story behind the action that's happening. So on a project like that, I would want to maybe like sketch out like the thought behind like, okay, what is this story that's happening here? Um,
Right.
but with this specific show and this style, it was more about like setting the tone and setting the mood, creating those style frames, and then kind of going in and saying, okay, like how can we make this animate and continue to show this tone and set this like darker mood for the show.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear that because, earlier in our conversation you had kind of mentioned, like you didn't have imagery from, Faye herself. You didn't have access to any of that kind of like archival stuff. I think you had even mentioned too in your case study that you really didn't even see like a cut
No,
of the
yeah.
series going into this project, which I thought was like really interesting too. Yes, you guys were given sort of like the brief, from FX and everything, but I thought that was just like kind of a really interesting note that you had kind of put out there too. But because of that, because you didn't have access to like any of this archival imagery or imagery of Faye that you could work with, or even really maybe some elements from the show itself, what were some of the solutions you and the team tossed around initially to get around this? I know you mentioned that ultimately you guys used photos of you guys as the team, and like kind of like made them like identity less because you weren't kind of including like full facial sort of framing for the elements you used. But just curious, like what some of the other solutions were, if there were at all, before you landed on that.
Yeah, initially something we really hung on to, and this didn't end up being right for the project, but I think I touched on it a little before, but were elements of Faye herself. There were these like big descriptions in the brief of who she was as a person, the how they wanted to frame her in the documentary. There were a lot of things like she dressed really well, like she was always kind of in these like floral dresses, very like 90s, but always had like her makeup done and she was always like ready for the camera, which was a criticism that they were potentially going to highlight in the documentary. But again, we didn't see it, so we weren't really sure the direction it was going to take. So at first we really hung on to that element a lot. I think that like the designs that I explored had a lot of that in there. There were a few that I helped out with that kind of only focused on these like floral patterns and a little bit more typography based again because we weren't really sure what the visual tone of the show would be, which was like a nice way to get around like, okay, we don't have a ton to show. How can we still like set that tone through the typography that we're using? Um, there was a really great one that Ben Hill came up with that it was also it was showing more of a collage scene of more like neighborhoods because this happened primarily in the suburbs using like silhouettes of children, so that was another, it was a little bit more graphic than the photographic direction that we ended up going with. So that was another way of getting around, okay, we don't have visuals, but you have these settings that, especially for all of us, we come from like, a lot of us come from like a similar, suburban neighborhood. It kind of was like any day, everyday America where these things were taking place. Um, so it was easy to pull from, okay, this is the type of setting that this was happening in. So maybe let's show that, or let's show more of Faye. So those were other ways that we explored. But in the end, again, like the photography and like seeing these children, it really like is pulls on your humanity a little bit more.
For sure. No, absolutely. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. Well, it's cool to hear that you guys were exploring some like graphical stuff too. Like, yeah, like not just the imagery. I love hearing kind of like the internal problem solving around, well, we don't have access to this imagery, so how can we represent it? It's really cool to
Yeah.
kind of hear the kind of different avenues you guys were going down for that. That's really awesome. Well, because you guys didn't see a cut of the docuseries before working on this either, what elements, and you might have touched upon this a little bit with the previous question, but what elements did you find the most helpful to set the right tone, mood, and style for the promo package? Kind of sounds like, taking the kids' photos of you all or photos of you growing up is, probably the answer. But I'm just curious, like, and even in terms of like the color and, textures that you developed and is the text that you used as well, just curious, like,
Yeah. Well, thinking about the
yeah.
time period was really important. Like, okay, it's early 90s. We
Oh,
didn't
true.
want anything that felt super slick because I
Hmm.
mean, it ended up working out really well. I sometimes I do wonder, like in the end, seeing the final documentary, they ended up using the logo that we created, which I was shocked. I thought they were gonna, they had like their own that they would come up with. And a
Oh, cool.
lot of the animation styles of the graphics within the documentary ended up feeling very in line with what we had done. So I do wonder if they saw what we did and then that influenced how they ended up with the in post production.
Oh,
Because
that's
it
awesome.
was so similar. So we really lucked out. And I mean, we're all our creative directors, everyone is like, they're so talented. So it just is natural that, you're making these assumptions and hopefully you're right. And we ended up like kind of nailing it, which was really great to see. Because I was afraid that in the end, the tone of the show was going to feel totally different than what these like promos that we came up with. But yeah, in the end, just staying true to that time period was really important. And making things look like they were on film, really, very tactile. I think that all was something that we hung on to. We didn't want really slick animation, just
Right.
feeling a little bit more made in camera versus something that was like slid around and slick in After Effects.
Right, right, right. Well, and what I love about the piece too, and this frame that you've chosen to select and everything, is that, you've touched upon, like it's the time period, the 90s. We kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit, yeah, nothing like too modern or contemporary that's and slick. But the desaturation and the kind of fadedness and of stuff kind of brings in, I don't know if nostalgia is the right word, but it kind of like, yeah, it touches a, it brings out that sort of like timely aspect of the piece as well. And then the desaturated tones, because what I love about this frame and the piece in general is that, like there's this beautiful mix of cool tones and warm tones. Like it's not exclusively one or the other. You kind of like do flicker between the two in the piece. For anyone who hasn't seen it, go check it out because it just, the tone and mood of this piece is just so perfectly done. And I think that that's what's really great about it too, is like, you're hitting on the time period with the way that you're using textures and color and the imagery. It's just altogether came together beautifully. Like,
Oh,
so
thank
yeah,
you.
hearing
Wow.
you talk about it is really cool because I can see it visually as well.
Yeah, thank
Well,
you. It was a really great process, and just that collage style. It's so it really is perfect for anything that's set in. I think you're right with the nostalgia is the right word. Like bringing in that texture, and that's
right.
kind of a big part of this documentary. Is like this thing that was happening in the 90s. It was just a different time. You don't want things to feel really slick, so that was like a huge part of it.
For sure. Well, and you touched on this a little bit too. I don't know if you saw my questions before we jumped on the call together, but you touched on the animation, which was something I really wanted to talk with you about too, real quickly. Like you said, it's not this sort of even slick moving animation. Once you get past the design part and you jump into the animation, you had already said, you wanted to make sure that was going to continue to sort of carry the mood and tone of the piece further. And it's this, it's like this jittery, eerie style. So I'm curious, how did you and the block and tackle team know what types of movements would reinforce this tone?
Yeah, so they had actually done a pitch for I think The Old Man it was called, where they had explored like a version of that sort of style. There was a little bit less depth in that design. So that was something that I really wanted to come through, where you're feeling this like layering and feeling as though it's this ominous space kind of. So that was a something that we added in, but that was the initial inspiration for like how the animation direction could go. And then it's just building on top of that, like, and exploring that even further. Um, it's, I think, like, again, just making sure things aren't feeling too slick, and that the timing is right. You want things to feel jittery without feeling like things are being thrown in your face constantly.
Right.
Like that can sometimes happen when you're going in a direction that feels a little bit more tactile. So having these moments where things are slowing down and there is a little bit of a drift to it in order to have that feeling of space, and as though it brings a little bit more, it makes it a little bit more ominous, if it's not
Right.
just like quick and flashy the whole time.
Right. No, no, and that's so true. I mean, you couldn't have said it better. I mean, like the combination of the drifting with the quick sort of like, catch here or catch there, does, bring out the tone and mood of the piece even further. And it's funny that you said, like if it was just doing this the whole time, it would either come off like a distraction or would come off incorrect. And I think that's what's so interesting about our industry too, is that like even people who aren't motion designers or animators or designers by background and doing this work, people who are watching the show on TV or wherever they're watching it, like it's kind of funny how you can immediately tell whether you're in this field or not, like like, oh, that comes off like a mistake, like if it's like too jittery or whatever. So you guys nailed it even with the animation too, that like this beautiful combination of just like slow drifting and then maybe just like a quick like blip here or there, like it adds to it so much. So kudos to you guys, your creative director. It's really cool. It's really cool to hear sort of the thought process behind that.
Yeah, and there is so much of a feeling to it. Kind of like I said with the
Yes.
collage. Similarly with this style, there's a there it's what feels right, and in the end,
Hmm.
like you can kind of sit back and watch it over and over, and then you realize like, oh, there's too many blips happening here, or that
Right.
cut, having a little bit of like a match cut really helps in making it not feel
Right.
like there's just too much happening. It's you have to pull back sometimes. So but it's also really, again, I love that sweet spot of just like, okay, what feels right, and sitting with something until you figure out like, oh, there's just a little bit, this is just a little bit off, or this is jittering just a little bit too much, we need to slow that down. And it's all about just like getting a feel for what feels right.
No, it's yeah, that there's that sweet spot of like timing, pacing, it's
Yeah.
just it is perfect. It's very on point. Well, we've talked about, some of the constraints around this project. You didn't have access to certain imagery. You were working within not a shortish timeline, but like a relatively small timeline for the project. I'm curious, what would you say based on, everything, the creative brief, everything that you were given, everyone on the project, what would you say the biggest challenge and reward was by working on this project and this frame?
I think definitely the biggest challenge would be, not having access to the show. I think that's like, it's tough to get around mentally, that fear of like, is what I'm doing going to fit right with this in the end? And I think for me, even, I found this challenging working in a studio. I've mentioned this before, where it's like you don't have direct contact with the director of the documentary and like the person making the show, which is just the way the industry is built at this point. But for me, that coming from a background where I did have that access, it was a little bit of a struggle not being able to have like direct conversations with the person who cares most about this. Um, but in the end, I think, like I said, we ended up, just nailing the visuals in a way that I do think influenced the way the packaging for the actual show turned out. So that was really rewarding to see it on TV and be like, oh, they used the logo that I made, and I had no idea. We thought that was just a temporary logo. So it was really great to see, like, oh, wow, we really nailed it despite not having so much information about what this was going to be. We were able to just come up with something that, we felt was appropriate for the time period and for the topic. And we ended up being pretty correct. So that was really satisfying.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I bet that's got to be a great feeling for sure. Well, this might be the same answer, but I'll ask it anyway. What about this frame makes it your favorite frame?
So I actually really love that it has my boyfriend's family in it. It was just really fun to use all of the photography from everybody's personal lives, and that was really fun process. Like we kind of put a call out to everybody at the studio, and then like people's families, also people's significant others, like everybody just like gave all this photography. So it was really fun to like go through all of that and see everybody as a child. And that was just like a fun element of the show. So I was really glad that and that photo in particular, I felt like right away was like the perfect element for the title scene. It showed a little bit more of the children versus like you kind of just get quick glimpses in some of the other elements, whether that's like the countdown or some of the other graphics elements of the package. So I thought that like the style of clothing and it being three children together, it felt very happy family, but what is really going on behind the
Right.
scenes. Um, and it was just like exciting that we found such like a perfect photo just from the resources that we had.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I mean it's funny how it kind of makes the project like even a little bit more personal for you guys
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
Even though it's like, a topic and a story completely removed from you, like there's still like a little personal aspect to it. That's really cool. That's awesome.
yeah. And it's super satisfying also not having, sometimes in my overall career, I felt like, oh, I just don't know all of the best programs and all of the best ways to like create imagery. And
Right.
then sometimes the best answer really is just like you get a little bit scrappy with it. Like, what can I find and what do I have access to? And so when that more lo-fi approach is really appropriate and it really nails it, it feels really good to know like, okay, I don't always need to be like up on everything on Cinema 4D, and like maybe I don't have all the latest access to all the best things, but you could still find the answer in the ways that you have access to. So
Absolutely. And you're speaking to, I think, what is most important about the work that we do as motion designers and animators in this industry is that we're creative problem solvers. So, whether we know all the, new flashiest tools and plugins or not, like it's really coming down to like your mind, your creative thinking, and how you're problem solving for
Yeah.
either your own personal projects or your clients' projects, and how you're helping to tell that story. So you couldn't have said it any better, Jamie. Well, this has been wonderful. This has been so much fun talking about this project. I'm so happy that you chose this frame and this project to talk about, and for sharing it with us in the audience. If people want to connect with you and learn more about what you're working on, what's the best way for them to do so?
Oh yeah. So, I have my website. I'm not super active on social media, so I think just like throwing me an email is the best way. I absolutely love connecting with people. I'm in also like the Panimation Slack. I think that's where we met.
Yes, yes.
So any of those less common ways are the best way to get a hold of me. Trying to get off social media as much as possible.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, we'll be sharing your information, your website, and links to some of the resources we mentioned here for our audience to check out. But that wraps it up for today, everyone. Feel free to email us at styleframesatpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear what you think of the show. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, if you like what you see and hear here, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and review the show on your favorite podcasting platforms as well. And lastly, come connect with us on social. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again, Jamie, for joining us today. And we'll see you all in the next one.